Detectives are now looking at two completely different stories about the night Lynette Hooker vanished. One story came from Brian Hooker, the other came directly from his own device. And federal agents close to this investigation say those two stories do not line up. Think about what that actually means. Remember, this whole case started out as an apparent tragic accident on the open water. A married couple, a tiny dinghy, pitch black water. A sudden fall overboard and a frantic rescue mission that ended with only one survivor returning home. But as detectives dug deeper, his story collided with hard evidence he simply could not explain. Cold, hard data. No rumors, no internet theories, just raw data. A GPS app tracking movements silently in the background. A strange 11-hour blackout from the boat's own transponder. A sailboat seized by federal agents. And an infrared camera that was quietly capturing everything without anyone even realizing it. Right now, deep inside an FBI forensic lab, analysts are dissecting digital evidence pulled from the boat at the heart of this mystery. They are trying to answer a question that gets more disturbing by the day. Not where Lynette Hooker is, but whether the story of how she vanished is actually true. And it all traces back to one specific timestamp, 9:29 p.m. April 4th, 2025, in the Abacos, Bahamas. That was the very second their sailboat Soulmate went dark on maritime tracking networks. For the next 11 hours and 11 minutes, the vessel completely vanished from the grid. No one knew what was happening on board during the precise window that detectives are now so focused on. Then, the tracking signal flickered back on. The boat was back, but Lynette Hooker was gone.
And the evidence uncovered since then could completely rewrite everything we know about this case.
Before we go on, this story involves an active missing person case with some highly sensitive details. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. To understand why federal agents are laser-focused on those 11 hours, we must go back to the very beginning, to the dream retirement that brought Lynette and Brian Hooker to these islands. Long before detectives started analyzing GPS data, before federal agents impounded the boat and began dissecting hard drives in an FBI forensics lab, there was a totally different side to this story. One that looked picture-perfect from the outside. Spring 2025. The Bahamas. Crystal water, quiet island towns. Days dictated by the tides and the weather, rather than alarm clocks and job schedules. For Lynette and Brian, this was no temporary vacation. It was their entire life. For years, they had been chasing a dream most people only ever talk about. Ditching the 9-to-5, buying a yacht, and sailing off into the horizon. Their sailboat, Soulmate, was a floating home, a dream retirement, and a life of constant motion. According to family, friends, and their own online posts, sailing was far more than a hobby. It was their everything. The couple spent years sharing their adventures aboard the vessel, fixing it, traveling on it, and living on it full-time. Dozens of videos showed them working side by side, painting decks, navigating open water, exploring old coastal towns, and always mapping out the next harbor. Lynette seemed completely comfortable on the ocean. This was no novice out for a weekend cruise. She lived and breathed this ocean life for years as a dedicated wife, mother, and partner. A seasoned sailor. A woman who traded stable land life for an unpredictable yet deeply liberating existence at sea. And for years, this freedom was precisely what she had been searching for. Old video footage shows her smiling as their boat, Soulmate, prepared to leave Texas for the sea. "We are finally leaving Kima," she said eagerly as their new journey began. Back then, it truly seemed like the beginning of an incredible new chapter. No viewer could have guessed where this story would lead, because somewhere along their path, the sailing couple transformed into something almost symbolic. They became the ultimate escapees, the ones who successfully left it all behind.
No offices, no daily commutes, no grinding routine. Just a beautiful yacht, the open ocean, and another horizon waiting to be explored.
By early 2025, the tropical waters of the Bahamas became their home. The Hooker family had spent years sailing the Caribbean islands and coastal waters, posting updates and sharing their journey online along the way. From the outside, their lifestyle looked peaceful, almost enviable. Yet what makes this mystery so chilling is how every happy image from before Lynette went missing feels totally disconnected from the dark reality. When detectives finally started piecing together the events of April 4th, they did not see a suspicious vessel tied to a grim investigation. They saw the very same yacht that carried a retired couple through years of travel. The exact same boat featured in happy family photos. The boat they proudly called home. And that haunting contrast really matters. Because this tragic story does not begin with an active crime scene. It starts with a couple heading back from shore on a routine evening trip to their boat. A short boat ride so ordinary, neither could have predicted it would be the final night Lynette Hooker was ever seen alive. According to her husband, Brian Hooker, everything went wrong between Hopetown and the Soulmate on April 4th, 2025. Hopetown is easily one of the most beautiful spots in the Bahamas. Think colorful cottages, narrow pathways, and crystal clear ocean, the perfect escape from stressful everyday life. For this sailing couple, Lynette and Brian, this port was supposed to be just another routine stop on their endless voyage. As dusk approached, the pair got ready to leave land and head back too. Their sailing yacht, Soulmate, anchored just offshore. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. They had likely made this exact journey dozens of times before. To travel back and forth, they relied on a small dinghy, only 8 feet long. A simple tender designed strictly for quick trips. Not for deep water cruising, and certainly not for night navigation. Just a basic way to reach the boat they called home. Brian Hooker claimed they left the Hopetown docks around 7:30 that evening. By then, the daylight was fading. As the sun sank below the horizon, conditions out on the water grew increasingly rough.
Brian later reported facing choppy, rough seas.
The wind picked up as weather conditions deteriorated. These specifics matter because, by his account, the next moments unfolded incredibly fast. Somewhere in the dark between Hopetown and the Soulmate, Lynette Hooker entered the water. Brian's story has stayed mostly the same. He claims Lynette fell overboard. More importantly, he says she had the dinghy's ignition key when she hit the water. And when she sank into the darkness, he claims that vital key vanished right along with her. That lone detail quickly became the cornerstone of his entire story. Because in Brian's version, losing that key meant losing the engine. And losing the motor meant losing any real hope of chasing after Lynette in the water. Instead, he claims he tried rowing to reach her. He later detailed his desperate struggle to get back to her. But he claims the wind and current kept pushing them apart. Every passing second only stretched the distance. With every minute, the odds of finding her plummeted. Finally, he claims, she vanished completely. Think about the picture detectives had to piece together from there. A husband stranded alone in a small boat. Darkness. Open ocean. No working motor. No trace of Lynette. No eyewitnesses. No cameras. No objective record of what went down during those critical minutes. At first, it looked like a devastating maritime tragedy. The kind of disaster that strikes in just seconds, leaving behind a mountain of questions and very few answers. But right from those first few days, there were anomalies investigators had to untangle. Like, why did Lynette have the ignition key in her hand? When exactly did she go overboard? And how long did Brian actually search for her? Which path did the dinghy actually take after that? And maybe most critical of all, what happened in the hours that followed? Because in Brian's version, after he lost Lynette, he kept drifting alone. Hours dragged by in the pitch black until he finally steered toward Marsh Harbor, docking there in the early morning of April 5th. Right then, it looked like everyone's worst nightmare had come true. A devastating accident at sea.
A wife lost.
A shattered husband and a massive rescue mission getting underway. But detectives would soon dig up a detail that completely upended their whole timeline. An event that took place while Lynette was still lost. An event logged at exactly 9:29 p.m. That was the exact moment the Soulmate stopped broadcasting its location to the world. In the beginning, police were just trying to answer one straightforward question.
What happened to Lynette Hooker?
But as weeks went by, a different question began to surface. A question that had absolutely nothing to do with eyewitnesses, police interviews, or human memory. Instead, it centered entirely on a timestamp, 9:29 p.m. Because, as detectives carefully pieced together the events of April 4th, they stumbled upon a clue that would become the most debated piece of evidence in the investigation. The Soulmate had suddenly stopped broadcasting its location. To understand why this is crucial, we have to look at a system few outsiders know about, AIS, the Automatic Identification System. It is essentially a ship's unique digital footprint. Its digital footprint across the dark water. AIS constantly broadcasts vital information about a vessel, including its identity, position, heading, and speed. Other ships see it. Land-based tracking stations pick it up. Entire maritime tracking networks follow it. More importantly, these networks archive everything, every transmission, every turn, and every coordinate. For investigators, this digital trail is invaluable because human memory is fragile. Witnesses get confused, and their stories change as days pass. But electronic tracking logs are different. They record movements in real time, minute by minute, coordinate by coordinate, which is why the events of April 4th instantly raised red flags. Tracking logs reviewed by detectives show that the vessel's Soulmate was broadcasting normally all evening. Then, at exactly 9:29 p.m., the feed went completely dead. Not 9:28, not around 9:30, exactly 9:29 p.m. That level of accuracy is critical because detectives are not looking at a broad, fuzzy window. They are looking at one precise second, a moment that matches the night Lynette Hooker vanished. At first, that detail might seem trivial. After all, marine gear fails. Connections drop all the time. Tech glitches happen, but detectives immediately spotted something highly suspicious. These tracking systems are built to run non-stop, especially through the challenging conditions boaters face after dark. Rough seas, thick fog, and unpredictable weather. These are the exact moments those trackers are built for. This is why detectives focused not just on the missing person, but on this sudden digital silence. Because the moment the signal died, a new mystery began. A massive hole opened up in their timeline, and all automated tracking data vanished. The boat could no longer be traced using standard maritime surveillance, which had tracked its path perfectly earlier that evening, and the timing was impossible to ignore. By then, according to Brian Hooker's story, Lynette was already in the deep water. She was gone. The search for the truth was already underway. Yet this was the precise window when the vessel's digital trail went dark. Naturally, detectives demanded answers. Was there a logical explanation? Was it a clue? Was it directly tied to her vanishing? Or was it just a terrible coincidence on the absolute worst night of their lives? These questions grew more critical as the police investigation deepened. Because detectives know better than anyone that timelines are everything. In high-stakes cases, the timeline becomes the entire investigation. Forget fragile memories or personal beliefs. What can actually be pinned down on a clock? What is verifiable? What can we actually prove? Now, detectives had one precise timestamp they couldn't ignore, 9:29 p.m. The instant soulmate vanished from tracking screens, making an already complex missing persons case far more difficult. And most critical of all, the start of a dark window that detectives still cannot piece together using tracking data. Because once that signal went dead, the boat became a ghost. No location updates, no digital trail, just absolute silence. As the hours dragged on, the darkness only deepened. The search for Lynette grew urgent, and somewhere in the dark waters of the Abacos, the soulmate drifted, completely invisible to the maritime tracking systems that had been logging its every move earlier that night. Then, the following morning, something changed. The signal suddenly returned, and when investigators finally mapped out those missing hours, they realized the AIS blackout was just one piece of a far bigger puzzle. Because another stream of digital evidence had been silently recording that night as well. And what it recorded would raise an entirely new set of questions. By this point, investigators knew they were no longer dealing with a standard missing person case. They were looking at a timeline with a massive hole in it. And not just any gap, an 11-hour blackout. The kind of gap detectives spot instantly because it sits right in the middle of the critical window. Let us go back to that timestamp, 9:29 p.m., when the soulmate's AIS signal stopped. Then, according to maritime tracking logs, later analyzed by detectives and journalists, the vessel was completely missing from AIS tracking until roughly 8:40 the next morning, 11 hours and 11 minutes. No public record of its path. No continuous digital breadcrumbs showing where the vessel went during those hours, just a start point and an end. To investigators, that massive gap was evidence in itself. Not because a silent signal automatically proves anything, it does not, but because every solid investigation relies on one core principle. When critical data vanishes during the most important part of a timeline, detectives must find out why. Look at what authorities were dealing with. A woman had vanished. The final known moments happened at sea. The main vessel tied to the case suddenly stops broadcasting its location. And that silence starts during the exact same window of time that investigators are working to reconstruct. They needed answers, because AIS is not just a convenience for sailors. It is built for safety, navigation, spatial awareness, and accountability. At any given second, AIS helps ships identify each other, prevent collisions, and track paths across the open sea. That is why maritime authorities scrutinize these systems closely. These AIS logs are often the closest thing detectives have to an unbiased witness. Not a human witness, but a machine, recording coordinates automatically as events unfold. Which is why the lack of that data matters so much, especially when detectives are trying to pinpoint exactly where a boat was during a critical window. As media coverage of the mystery began drawing national attention, outside experts began weighing in on what that blackout actually meant. One prominent voice was former federal prosecutor Tad DiBiase, and his unique perspective carried serious weight. DiBiase is not just some talking head analyzing a headline. He spent years prosecuting highly complex cases, especially cases where physical evidence and detailed timelines were absolutely crucial. Most notably,
He is widely respected for his expertise in so-called no-body homicides, cases where the state must prove a murder occurred even when the victim has never been recovered.
as DiBiase studied the publicly available evidence, he focused on a question detectives ask right at the start of a case. Where was the vessel? Not where someone remembers it, nor where they later claim it was. Where was it in reality? That distinction matters. In any investigation, you usually get two timelines, the one people report and the one you can actually verify. Sometimes those two align perfectly. Other times, they simply don't. And when they don't, detectives start digging much deeper. DiBiase publicly called that AIS blackout highly suspicious, because it happened right during the timeline detectives are trying to reconstruct. Again, that observation doesn't prove guilt.
It doesn't prove a crime took place, but it shows why detectives keep focusing on that blackout.
When you are trying to reconstruct a disappearance at sea, location tracking is gold. You need to know where vessels traveled,
When they stopped, when they sailed, and whether the data backs up their stories.
The problem here is that the AIS record suddenly goes dead silent.
Then hours later,
It blips back on, like a chapter ripped out from the middle of a book.
you can see what happened before and what happened after, but the pages in between are gone.
And those lost pages happen to cover the exact hours detectives desperately need to understand. What was the soulmate doing? Where was the vessel located?
What actually happened on board during those dark, silent hours?
At this point, detectives lacked answers, but they did have one crucial lead. They had a solid reason to look beyond AIS logs. Because while the ship's tracking transmitter may have gone dead, investigators soon found a different kind of digital evidence running quietly in the background. Evidence that was never meant to be part of the case. Data that allegedly came directly from Brian Hooker's own phone. Unlike the AIS, this data never vanished for 11 hours. In fact, it might have captured a totally different version of events. Until now, detectives had been working with a total lack of information. An 11-hour gap where the soulmate's AIS vanished entirely from the records. But then, the case shifted when authorities stumbled onto something else. Something that was never meant to see the light of day. A digital trail quietly recording everything in the background.
Unlike the AIS, this trail did not stop at 9:29.
According to reports on the case, federal agents pulled data from a marine navigation app on one of Brian Hooker's devices. To see why that matters, you have to understand how these apps operate. Today's marine navigation apps are basically digital chart plotters. They help boaters map routes, track positions, and monitor movement on the water. But many of these apps do something else too. They record automatically, running silently in the background. The user does not even need to map a route or manually save their location. The software continuously logs where the device goes, leaving a digital breadcrumb trail of every single movement. And that log would quickly become one of the most critical breakthroughs in the case.
Because later reports from CBS News revealed a critical detail.
Detectives pulled GPS coordinates from a device linked to Brian Hooker. This digital footprint tracked movement on the water the night Lynette vanished. Even more concerning,
Sources close to the case stated those recorded movements did not match the maps Brian originally handed over to police.
That discrepancy was massive because up until that moment,
the police were mostly chasing a story. Brian's version of events.
His memory of the places and his word on where everything happened.
But now they had a new witness, one that did not rely on human memory. A witness that was not created after the fact, silently logging coordinates in real time as the night unfolded. Suddenly, detectives were not just weighing one person's word against another's.
They were measuring a story against hard data. And according to case files, those two timelines of that night did not match up.
Consider what that means for a homicide investigation. Picture reconstructing a complex crime scene.
A suspect tells you their location, but security cameras place them somewhere else entirely.
That is the exact red flag detectives immediately zero in on. Not because it proves guilt, but because contradictions demand answers.
Answers require verification, and that verification brings detectives closer to the truth.
For this mystery, the core question was simple. If the digital coordinates do not match the path Brian described,
Which timeline is the real one? The story he told or the path recorded?
and if they do not match, why is that? On the water, these questions are vital because location is absolutely everything.
Unlike a concrete street, the open ocean washes away evidence instantly.
There are no intersections, no street cameras, no witnesses, and no tire tracks. Out at sea, Digital tracking data is often the only objective evidence available. It maps out timelines, tracking travel patterns, sudden stops, turns, and target search zones. That is why investigators rely so heavily on independent digital evidence. The waves can swallow physical clues, but technology leaves a permanent trail. According to reports, the GPS tracking showed the device traveling through the Sea of Abaco, pausing, then returning to land. Analysts concluded those movements did not align with the map Brian Hooker initially gave police. But at this point, we have to recognize what the data cannot say. It does not prove what happened to Lynette Hooker out there. It does not show motive. It does not establish intent, nor does it explain the conflicting routes. But it does give detectives something they desperately needed: an objective, independent record. A second version of events. One completely separate from interviews, human memory, or convenient explanations. When investigators face two conflicting versions of that night, they cannot just pick one. They test both stories because somewhere in the gap lies the truth. By this point, the entire investigation was starting to shift. The investigation was no longer just about the disappearance itself. It was shifting toward physical evidence, the AIS blackout, satellite tracking, and timeline gaps. Every fresh lead kept pointing investigators back to one single location. Right back to the soulmate. Because the further they dug into the electronic records, the more they suspected the yacht itself held the crucial answers they desperately needed. By now, detectives were handling much more than just a missing person case. They were facing a mountain of data, including that strange AIS blackout, along with route records and gaps in the official timeline. As these puzzle pieces came together, attention shifted back to the one constant that had been there from day one, the soulmate itself. Because if Lynette Hooker vanished during the timeline her husband Brian described, then this vessel was far more than just a crime scene. It was central to everything. Every turn, every onboard computer, and every signal suddenly became critical, and federal agents treated it that way. In early May, federal agents seized the soulmate. For the very first time since Lynette vanished, investigators had unrestricted access to the ship and all its onboard systems. That major move tells us something very important. Federal authorities do not seize and search a yacht of this size simply because it was nearby. They do it because they suspect the boat holds clues that can help them rebuild the entire story. And at this point, rebuilding that timeline was the main goal. No guesswork, no assumptions. Just hard facts. Investigators needed to know where the yacht traveled, which onboard systems were running, what telemetry was saved, and if any of it could finally explain those missing hours. Initially, the boat was kept in Florida, but agents later moved it to a specialized lab for a deep forensic sweep. That might sound like routine paperwork, but it proves detectives were doing much more than a standard search. They were setting up for an incredibly thorough, high-tech forensic teardown. Think of everything a modern boat carries: radar, GPS networks, and marine electronics. Radios, onboard computers, hard drives, location apps, and automated digital logs tracking every single movement. We often think of boats as purely mechanical things, but today's yachts are essentially floating servers packed with data. Every trip leaves a digital trail. Every machine logs activity, and detectives wanted to extract every byte. Because unlike human memory, digital files do not fade or get confused. They never forget. They do not change their story months later. When secured correctly, they give investigators an airtight timeline they can actually prove. That is exactly why this vessel became so critical. Not because detectives thought the physical hull held the answers, but because its internal tech might, and that is a huge difference. A yacht cannot talk, but its software can, its route logs can, its hard drives can. But its digital records could. In complex cases, particularly when someone vanishes at sea, detectives count on tech to fill the blanks left by human memory.
And in this case, the gaps were widening.
Unanswered questions about movement, timing, and direction.
Questions about exact coordinates, questions that hard data could answer far better than human memory. As federal agents started combing through the boat, they zeroed in on those exact digital systems. Navigation records, onboard electronics, digital hard drives, anything that recorded what happened before, during, or after Lynette vanished into the night. The objective was clear: piece together the most precise timeline they could. Minute by minute, turn by turn, coordinate by coordinate. Because somewhere in that chronological sequence, detectives believed the truth was hiding. Then, their focus shifted to a specific piece of equipment aboard the Soulmate, a device that could have been capturing data as the tragedy unfolded. A system that has no need for daylight. An instrument that keeps running, whether anyone knows it is active or not. And if it was running that evening, it might have quietly recorded things nobody realized were being tracked. At this point, detectives had gathered key pieces of a highly complex puzzle. They had the AIS Blackhat. They had positioning data pulled from onboard electronic systems. They had an expanding timeline of events, and they had seized the Soulmate itself. But there was another piece of onboard gear drawing their intense interest. A device functioning quite differently from standard navigation gear. GPS tools, or satellite trackers. Because unlike those devices, this one does not log where a yacht travels. Instead, it records what it observes, or more precisely, what it detects. The technology is called FLIR, short for forward-looking infrared. Plenty of seasoned sailors use FLIR cameras for extra safety when traveling at night. To see why, picture yourself standing on a boat deck in pitch-black darkness. No streetlights, no distant skyline, no landmarks, just the endless, dark ocean. Standard cameras are useless out there because they require visible light. But thermal cameras operate differently. Instead of registering light, they detect heat. Every object radiates heat. The ocean does, boats do, and human bodies do too. A thermal sensor translates these temperature differences into a clear picture, showing details that are completely invisible to the naked eye. That makes FLIR setups incredibly popular for boaters who travel after dark. They help identify other boats, navigation hazards, floating debris, and under the right conditions, even people, especially when visibility drops to zero. For detectives, this instantly raises one crucial question. Was the thermal camera active on the Soulmate the night Lynette Hooker went missing? And if so, what did those lenses capture? Right now, we have to be extremely careful to separate verified facts from sheer speculation. Because in mysteries like this, theories easily outpace actual evidence. We do know that early reports from the investigation confirmed the Soulmate carried an active thermal camera. Here's what we do know. Federal agents seized the boat and immediately began digging into the electronic gear they recovered. Several sources confirm that evidence pulled from the ship is currently being analyzed under a federal microscope. What remains a total mystery, at least to the public, is what that camera actually saw, if anything at all. Investigators haven't released any footage. They haven't described a single frame, nor have they shared what they found on that infrared thermal system. That distinction is absolutely crucial, because right now, the camera matters not for what it has already revealed, but for what it might still be hiding. Think about the sheer challenge investigators face. The most critical moments of this case allegedly went down. Dead of night, out on open water, with zero eyewitnesses. No security cameras nearby, no public lenses pointing toward the dark water. Those conditions present massive evidentiary challenges. But a working thermal camera operates in an entirely different league. It doesn't forget like a witness, and it never twists the truth. It just captures whatever crosses its line of sight. That is exactly why detectives are picking apart every piece of onboard tech. Each device is a new chance to verify, tear down, or reconstruct the entire timeline. By this point, the probe had grown far beyond a simple missing person case. Federal agents had stepped in. Digital footprints were being traced and electronic files carefully decoded. Reports close to the investigation show that some of this deep analysis happened inside high-tech federal forensics labs. The mission never changed: uncover exactly what went down on the night of April 4th. But detectives were no longer leaning on just one side of the story. They were piecing together the timeline from several angles simultaneously. AIS tracking, navigation logs, personal devices, and those thermal cameras. Every single source adding a new layer.
Letting investigators stress test every claim, because that is how you build a rock-solid federal case.
One raw data point at a time. One digital log at a time. One hard fact at a time. By this point, federal agents held something they desperately needed early on. Not complete answers, but real options. Multiple streams of raw evidence. Endless ways to reconstruct the scene, and fresh chances to see what holds water and what still looks highly suspicious. They held the AIS logs. GPS tracking, mobile forensics, and maybe thermal footage. It was no longer a question of having the puzzle pieces. Now, it was about what those pieces revealed, and more importantly, where this dark trail would lead them next. Right then, a major shift started to take place. Completely out of sight. The team wasn't just sitting back, sorting through files they had already gathered. Detectives were actively moving on the secrets the data was starting to whisper. When that pivot happens, it means the entire hunt has entered a dangerous new phase. Digital evidence is useless on its own. Its true power lies in where it points you. And new leaks from the investigation suggest newly analyzed data was finally pointing investigators towards specific coordinates in the waters surrounding the Bahamas. These were highly specific spots they wanted to examine closer. This shift is critical. For months, detectives were working backward, combing through dry records, scrutinizing devices, and rebuilding timelines, desperate to piece together what occurred on April 4th. But now, the hunt is moving forward, using hard physical evidence to pinpoint exact locations that might hold the truth. One specific stretch of the Sea of Abaco, near Elbow Cay and Hope Town, has drawn intense focus. According to reports on the case, investigators demanded authorization for deep water searches in a zone flagged by their sophisticated data analysis. And that reveals something major. Operations like this are never random. They are incredibly expensive, slow, and logistical nightmares, especially with various agencies and jurisdictions in play. Before pouring massive resources into a search, command needs a solid, evidence-based reason to go. And at this point, proof was the only thing they followed. Not wild internet rumors, but hard evidence. Because every single coordinate they inspect represents a vital question that demands an answer. What took place here? Why this specific spot? And is there a clue hidden underwater that explains what happened the night Lynette vanished? Meanwhile, behind the scenes, another critical move unfolded. It got far less attention than the GPS data or the AIS blackout, but it was massive. Federal agents quietly requested DNA samples from Lynette Hooker's immediate family. To an outsider, that sounds terrifying, but in truth, it is standard operating procedure for missing person investigations, especially during long-term searches. DNA references allow forensics to make positive matches if remains or biological clues ever surface. It is simply the most practical tool detective teams have. While taking these swabs does not guarantee a grim result, it shows exactly how seriously law enforcement is taking this mystery. Because at this stage, this was no longer a simple search for a missing boater. They were actively trying to solve a crime. That shift in focus is clear when looking at the massive response.
Just look at the muscle involved, including the Coast Guard Investigative Service,
The FBI, federal forensic experts,
and local police, multiple units tackling different angles of the same case.
some trace physical clues, some hunt down digital breadcrumbs, while others reconstruct the final hours on the water.
On their own, none of these clues give a final answer. But together, they paint a dark pattern. Detectives are not hanging their hopes on one single clue. They are layering AIS records, GPS tracks,
boat computer diagnostics, dive coordinates, and family DNA, using every piece to test and lock down the timeline. Because in the end, this case has become a total reconstruction.
a desperate effort to place everyone at exact locations.
To prove what occurred and see if the proof matches the story told to the public.
At this stage, detectives had gathered a larger mountain of evidence than ever before in the investigation. But raw facts alone cannot solve a mystery. You have to link it, cross-reference it, and build a timeline that actually makes sense. And that is precisely what detectives are doing now, piece by piece, location by location.
Dissecting record after record, chasing a question that remains unanswered months after Lynette Hooker disappeared.
What really happened on the night of April 4th? Because as detectives dug deeper, one reality became glaringly obvious. This was far more than a missing persons case. They were now investigating a timeline.
And that timeline grows sharper and sharper with every new piece of evidence they uncover.
Let us head back to the start. April 4th, 2026, Hopetown, Bahamas.
A married couple pushes off from the shore in a tiny dinghy. It should have been a completely routine run, the kind of trip they had made hundreds of times before.
Just another quick trip back to the sailboat they called home. But somewhere between Hopetown and the Soulmate, something went terribly wrong. Based on the account of Brian Hooker, Lynette went into the water.
He claims she had the dinghy ignition key on her and says the engine could not be restarted. He claims he tried desperately to reach her.
He says the wind and currents pushed them apart until he lost sight of her entirely, and that is where our story begins. But that is hardly where the investigation ends. Because once detectives started digging into the evidence,
the focus shifted away from human memory and toward what digital technology recorded. First came the timestamp, 9:29 p.m., the exact moment the Soulmate stopped sending AIS data. Next was the 11-hour silence, a total blackout of tracking data during the most critical window of this entire mystery.
Then came the GPS findings.
Information pulled directly from a marine navigation app. Data that officials close to the case say did not match the maps Brian Hooker previously gave authorities.
After that, authorities seized the vessel itself. Federal agents took control of the Soulmate, analyzing its onboard navigation systems, combing through digital files, and examining hardware that keeps logging data long after a night at sea has ended. And finally, focus shifted to the infrared camera,
an onboard system capable of filming in total darkness, which detectives deemed critical enough to include in their forensic sweep.
When you fit all those puzzle pieces together, a pattern starts to emerge.
Not a final conclusion, not a verdict.
Just a pattern.
A pattern of detectives leaning far more heavily on automated digital records than on anyone's personal version of events. Because that is what this case has turned into, a hunt for the truest possible timeline of that night. And at the very heart of that timeline sits the exact same mystery that has lingered since day one. What actually occurred during those 11 hours?
What happened after the AIS signal cut out? What took place between 9:29 p.m. and the next morning?
Because despite every piece of evidence seized,
those hours remain the most critical and least understood chapter of the entire investigation.
And we must remember, at this point in time, there are still no definitive answers. This investigation is still wide open. Forensics are still analyzing evidence. Authorities haven't reached any final conclusions yet. Nobody has been convicted of a crime regarding Lynette Hooker's disappearance. And the most critical questions are still left completely unanswered. That's exactly why every single breakthrough matters. Every byte of data, every forensic test, every search sweep, and every major tactical decision. Each detail could help clarify a timeline that investigators are still desperately trying to reconstruct. To the public, this looks like a standard missing person case. But for detectives, the focus is quickly shifting to something else entirely. A timeline built from digital GPS records and AIS transmissions. Recovered electronic devices. Forensic analysis and secret evidence that hasn't been leaked to the public yet.
It's a timeline starting with a couple departing Hopetown together, which changes forever at 9:29 p.m. on April 4th, when the soulmate suddenly goes dark.
What really happened during those blank hours is still the biggest unsolved mystery of this entire case. Now, I want to hear your theories on this. Which piece of evidence stands out as the most crucial to you?
The sudden AIS blackout, the strange GPS discrepancies,
The boat's forensic sweep, or the infrared camera footage detectives are reviewing. Please keep the comment section respectful.
Let's stick to verified facts.
And remember, there's an active investigation happening here, with real lives and a family desperate for answers. As fresh details come to light, we'll keep following the trail, wherever it leads.